I don't think anybody's happy this morning, but there's no deal. So how you feeling? What's on the horizon?
Well, that's right. The one thing missing is the compromise, that where everybody gives a little and nobody's completely happy. That compromise did not happen. So we've got a mess on our hands, and the legislature will be back in yet another special session. This one that'll cost the taxpayers more money because legislators will be drawing their per diem. We hope to finish by June 4th, which was the regular session ending date, but they didn't do that. So we're going to be back to talk about revenue now. The budget did pass, and we obviously haven't had a chance to review everything in it yet. We think we have a pretty good feel for what it looks like, but we'll talk about that today. The budget passed, but the revenue to support the budget did not pass. So you have a situation where the budget has passed, protects the Department of Health. So our whole issues related to Medicaid and related to private partner hospitals are covered in the budget. That's about the only thing that's covered. Everything else is greatly at risk and greatly reduced because the money was not found to make up the shortfall. So we're talking about the Department of Corrections and Department of Children and Family Services, Juvenile Justice, COPS, higher ed, sheriff's housing.
Doesn't the budget though have the third of the penny extended?
No,
it does not.
That did not pass either. That measure didn't pass, and the real vote was on the amendment that would have raised the 1/3 of a penny to 1/2 of a penny, which would have basically taken care of our problems. It would have still been significant cuts, but we were prepared to deal with those cuts. But that fell short. It required 70 votes. It got 64, and then actually I think a couple of votes have changed after the fact, but basically it was reported as 63, and it needed 70.
As it stands right now, the Senate version was, just to bring everybody up to speed, the Senate version was 1/2 a penny for 7 years, the House version 1/3 of a penny for 5. Do you see a compromise in those two positions at this point?
Well, frankly, I think there's going to have to be a compromise. There's too much damage being done, and the public will see that as these next few days unfold, and we talk about the magnitude of the cuts to all of these areas and the consequences of not finding a reasonable solution like the one that was on the table last night that had very, very broad-based bipartisan support. I mean, this compromise proposal came out of the Senate with 32 or 33 votes out of 39. It was truly the compromise from both houses. When it went back to the House, though, the 70 votes were not there, and it's just very, very unfortunate because this was a very reasonable compromise that reduced the overall burden on taxpayers of Louisiana by well over $400 million. It cut approximately $200 million overall out of what the budget would have otherwise looked like, and it provided adequate funding for the things that everyone says is important to the state. So these legislators who wouldn't agree on this compromise now are going to, hopefully they're going to hear from people that this is unacceptable. This is the state of Louisiana is better than this, as the governor said last night, well after midnight.
Does the governor sign this budget?
We'll talk about that today. He made no announcement last night as to what he does. Obviously, it'll have to be reviewed, and if it is signed, there are things that potentially could be the subject of veto. But I'm not sure that will be the case either. We just hadn't had time to talk about it and review everything. We'll start that process this morning.
And what would be the difference between calling another special session without signing the budget and or the governor signing the budget and then calling another special session to fix that budget? Is there a difference between those two, and can either of those be done?
Well, if the budget is signed, then we know what the spending for the state is going to look like. We will have a budget, and the way the budget passed, you have what's called above-the-line funding, which means it's funded fully, like the Department of Health. Everything else was placed in the budget below the line, meaning it was subject to the appropriation of additional revenue. So if you have the budget signed, then you will know what the budget of the state is going to look like, and the discussion will be, what about these things that are, quote, below the line? How much money are we going to raise to fund them?
In your mind, in the governor's mind, which of those two options would be the simpler, the easier of the two?
Well, I'll answer that question when the governor makes up his mind what he's going to do. As I said, he didn't make an announcement last night as to what would happen with the budget. We'll review it and then decide in the next several days what that situation will be.
Got this question for you from Dr. Jim Henderson. What should students faced with a default on TOPS do today?
They ought to go to the legislative website and identify those members of the House of Representatives that refuse to vote for the compromise and call them, write them, email them, come see them, and tell them this is unacceptable because TOPS is at risk. I mean, it's funded, I think, at 70%. Based upon the underlying budget that is available to the state. So if they want the additional, I believe it's 30% based upon 70% funding, they need to let their voices be heard. The same thing for people who are advocates of juvenile justice, of the Department of Children and Family Services, which is foster care and child abuse situations. Those who are interested in corrections, making sure we have adequate correction workers to take care of folks who are in prison. Sheriffs, because sheriffs are keeping thousands of state prisoners, and they are not adequately funded to maintain that service to us. And if they turn those inmates back to the state of Louisiana, it will cost us significantly more, and it will overcrowd our already crowded prisons.
It sounds like it's a game of chicken between the governor and some of the House Republicans. We're going to do this. Now you go cut off SNAP benefits. You go into LSU football. Let's see if you'll really do it, Governor Jay Dardenne. Let's see if you guys are big boys. Is that kind of what we're looking at here?
If there's a game of chicken underway, it's between the vast majority of this legislature and the governor against the minority of legislators. 63 representatives wanted this compromise. 32 or 33 senators wanted this compromise. It's a very small minority, relatively speaking, of House members who have refused, who have drawn the line in the sand and say, no, we're not going to vote for a half a penny. We're going to insist on it being a third of a penny. I mean, that seems pretty ridiculous, and it ought to most people who are looking at this. It makes that much of a difference, though, in the state's budget.
You know, Jay, we had talked about, I had asked you, I think we had asked the governor last time he was on, and a number of state legislators at the beginning of this just wrapped up legislative session. And it was basically that what's going to change? The governor's position hasn't changed that much about what he thinks the state needs. The legislator, the ideological makeup of the legislature hasn't changed. So why does the governor think that anything's going to be different this time? And you had said because of the reality of the situation. Now we've ended another special session, and we're right where we were. And the governor's going to call another special session.
Well, the governor made it very clear that he was willing to compromise, and he did. From the very get-go, the governor said we needed $648 million to really do what the state needed. He compromised. The vast majority of legislators compromised. What we hope is different is we will now specifically see what those minority members of the legislature, and I'm talking about in numbers, decided was not important enough to fund. And so if this budget stands as it is, then we'll know exactly what is at risk, and we'll be able to quantify what's going to happen if this money isn't raised. That's the job I'll start on in a few minutes, to try and figure out exactly how we would live with this amount of revenue and what cuts would be necessitated, how much of TOPS will be reduced, how much will higher ed not get funded, how much will sheriffs get for per diem, how much will we use to fund corrections, and so on and so on. And we'll start talking now about very real specific numbers, and legislators can listen to their constituents and decide if it's worth voting for a half a penny. The solutions aren't going to change. Now, there was an effort yesterday at the last minute to try and increase a bunch of business taxes, and Representative Harris couldn't muster any support for that in lieu of going from a third to a half of a penny. So my sense is we'll have the same debate once again at the taxpayers' expense. And by the way, the legislative budget passed fully funded with no reductions at all. No reductions in the legislative budget. Mm-hmm. The judicial budget passed with an increase. The executive budget did not pass. So we have the governor will also have to look at the legislative budget and the judicial budget, because that factors into the money that's available and the money that has been raised. And the question is, how much of the money that's been raised will have to go to fully fund those budgets which have passed. Our
last 30 seconds, State Representative Alan Seabaugh from Shreveport is being hailed a hero by some for his delaying tactics. Your opinion of what happened at the last minute last night?
Very unfortunate. The House wanted to have an opportunity to take another shot at that bill once they saw what the vote looked like, and the efforts at the end of the day were just absolutely outrageous and insulting to the people of this state, forcing them to yet another special session to address the same problem we've been talking about for a year and a half. This time it'll be at more expense to the taxpayers, with more per diem being paid to legislators.